Please, they said they'll stop his treatment if I don't pay tonight. Ava Thompson stared at the message on her cracked phone screen, her fingers trembling so badly she had to steady them against the cold metal arm of the hospital chair, the fluorescent lights above her buzzing softly, as if even they were tired of witnessing desperation like hers. And for a moment she couldn't breathe because typing those words felt like swallowing glass, like admitting out loud that she had reached the end of everything she could do on her own. But then from down the hall came the faint, uneven beeping of a monitor and the thin cry of her baby. And pride became something distant and useless, something she no longer had the luxury to hold on to as she forced herself to hit send before she could lose the courage, before she could rethink the humiliation of begging yet again for money she didn't have, money she couldn't earn fast enough, money that stood between her son and the care he needed. She lowered the phone into her lap, her eyes drifting toward the partially open door of the hospital room where little Noah lay hooked to machines that looked too big and too clinical for someone so small, his tiny chest rising and falling in fragile, uneven rhythms that made her heart twist tighter with every second, and the smell of antiseptic filled her lungs as she leaned forward, elbows on her knees, whispering under her breath that everything would be okay, even though she had no idea how that could possibly be true anymore. The nurse had been polite but firm just minutes ago, explaining billing procedures with practiced sympathy that couldn't hide the urgency beneath her tone, reminding Ava that the outstanding balance had to be addressed immediately or certain treatments would be delayed, and the word delayed had echoed in Ava's mind like a threat she couldn't outrun because she knew exactly what it meant. She knew how quickly things could change when a child was this fragile, how every hour mattered, how every decision could tip the scale in ways no mother should ever have to consider. Her phone remained silent in her hand, the seconds stretching long and unbearable as she imagined. The message sitting unread, or worse, being ignored, or met with frustration on the other end, and she squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to steady herself, trying not to let the panic rise too fast, because if she lost control now, she didn't know how she would recover, didn't know how she would walk back into that room and look at Noah without breaking completely. A sudden buzz jolted through her palm, sharp and unexpected, and her eyes snapped open as she lifted the phone, her breath catching in her throat at the sight of a reply already waiting there, faster than she had dared hope, faster than anything in her life had moved in days. And for a split second relief flooded her chest before confusion crept in just as quickly because the name on the screen didn't match the contact she had meant to reach, didn't match anything familiar at all, just a string of numbers she didn't recognize. And her stomach dropped as realization hit, like a cold wave washing over her, her fingers moving frantically as she checked the number she had dialed, the one she had copied and pasted in a rush of panic. And there it was, wrong by a single digit. One tiny mistake that now felt enormous and irreversible. Her face flushing with heat as embarrassment and dread tangled together in her chest. And she opened the message anyway, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears, expecting confusion, maybe irritation, maybe nothing helpful at all, but instead the words staring back at her made her freeze completely, made the air around her feel suddenly thinner, as if the world itself had paused to listen along with her. I think you sent this to the wrong number, but tell me where you are. The words on the screen did not make sense at first, not in the way she expected, not in the way strangers usually responded when dragged into someone else's crisis. And Ava's fingers hovered over the phone as her mind tried to catch up, her heart still racing from the shock of realizing she had sent everything to the wrong person. The hospital bill, the message, the desperation laid bare in a few short lines. And now this stranger was asking where she was as if that detail actually mattered, as if he intended to do something with the information. And that thought alone made her chest tighten with suspicion because nothing in her life had ever been that simple. Nothing had ever worked out because someone just decided to help. She swallowed hard and quickly typed back, her thumbs moving fast despite the tremor that had not left her hands, explaining that it was a mistake, that she was sorry, that he should ignore the message, that she would figure it out somehow, even though she had no idea how she was supposed to do that. And she pressed send with a kind of forced finality, as if ending the conversation could somehow undo the humiliation of it, could restore a small piece of the control she had already lost. For a few seconds there was silence again, and she exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, telling herself this was better, safer, that accepting help from a stranger was not something she could risk, not when everything about her situation already felt so fragile. But then the phone buzzed again almost immediately, sharper this time, more insistent, and she looked down to see another message appear, longer, more direct, the kind that did not allow easy dismissal. I understand it was a mistake, but the bill you sent is from St. Mary's Medical Center. Is your child there right now? Her breath caught again, the question hitting closer than she expected, too specific, too observant, and she felt a flicker of unease at how quickly he had pieced that together, how he had looked at the document instead of ignoring it like most people would have. And for a moment she hesitated, her instincts pulling her in opposite directions, one telling her to stop, to block the number and focus on what little control she still had, the other whispering that maybe, just maybe, this was the one opening she could not afford to close. Down the hall, the monitor beeped again, louder this time, followed by the soft murmur of a nurse's voice, and Ava's gaze snapped toward the doorway as her chest tightened painfully, the reminder cutting through her hesitation like a blade, because this was not about pride anymore, not about caution or fear of embarrassment. It was about time, and time was the one thing slipping through her fingers faster than anything else. And she could not ignore that reality no matter how uncomfortable it made her. She looked back at the phone, her vision blurring slightly as tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. And before she could overthink it again, before she could talk herself out of the only chance that had appeared in front of her all night, she typed out a short reply, her fingers moving with a fragile urgency that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. Yes, he is here. They said I have less than 2 hours. She stared at the message for a second, feeling the weight of it, the vulnerability of admitting that truth to someone she did not know. And then she sent it, her breath catching as if that single action had shifted something larger than she could see, something that was already moving in a direction she could not control. And as the message disappeared from her screen, her phone felt heavier in her hand, as if whatever came next would change everything, whether she was ready for it or not. Across the city, in a glass-walled office that overlooked a skyline glowing under the late evening lights, Daniel Whitmore stood motionless with his phone still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the message that had just come through as if the words might change if he read them again. But they did not. They stayed exactly the same, stark and urgent and impossible to ignore. And for a man who was used to filtering information quickly, making decisions in seconds, dismissing anything irrelevant, without a second thought, he found himself doing the opposite, replaying the message in his mind, focusing on the details that did not belong in a simple wrong number exchange. The hospital name, the attached bill, the quiet panic hidden between the lines, and most of all the time frame. Less than 2 hours, a detail that did not feel exaggerated or manipulative but painfully real. He walked slowly toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beneath him, but he was not seeing any of it. His attention locked somewhere far away in a hospital room he had never been to, with a woman he did not know and a child he had never met. And yet something about the situation refused to let him step back, refused to let him treat it like a mistake he could simply correct and forget. And his thumb hovered over the screen as he opened the image she had sent, zooming in on the hospital bill with a precision that bordered on instinct, scanning names, dates, details, and then he stopped, his breath slowing as his eyes settled on a single line, the patient name, Noah Thompson, and for a brief second something flickered across his expression, something unfamiliar and sharp, not recognition exactly, but a pause that did not belong to coincidence either. He exhaled quietly and lowered the phone just enough to think, but the silence in the room only made the decision louder, clearer, because this was not about logic anymore, not entirely. It was about a feeling he could not immediately explain, a pull that did not fit into the structured world he had built for himself, and he turned back toward his desk with sudden purpose, his movements shifting from stillness to action in a way that felt automatic, practiced, inevitable. He pressed a button on his desk phone, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that his assistant recognized instantly, instructing her to pull up everything available on St. Mary's Medical Center, to contact billing if necessary, to find out exactly what was happening there tonight. And there was no hesitation on the other end, only a quick acknowledgement. Before the line went quiet again, leaving Daniel alone with the decision he had already made even before the information came back. His phone buzzed again in his hand, and he looked down at the message she had sent, reading it once more, slower this time, as if committing it to memory, as if making sure there was no room for doubt left. And then he typed a reply without overthinking it, without questioning whether this crossed any boundaries that normally would have mattered, because in that moment none of those rules seemed relevant anymore. None of them carried the same weight as the urgency pressing against his thoughts. He paused for just a fraction of a second before hitting send, his reflection faintly visible in the glass behind him, composed but sharper now, more focused than it had been all evening. And as the message left his phone, there was no hesitation left in him at all, only a clear, forward motion that had already begun to reshape the rest of his night in ways he did not yet fully understand. Do not sign anything. I am on my way. The message appeared on Ava's screen like something unreal, like words that did not belong to her life. And for a moment she simply stared at it, her mind refusing to process what it actually meant because it was too direct, too certain, too immediate. And her first instinct was not relief but fear, a sharp, protective fear that rose from deep inside her chest as she reread the sentence again and again, her fingers tightening around the phone as if it might slip away and take whatever fragile chance this was with it. And she shook her head slightly, almost instinctively, as if trying to push the words away before they could settle into something she might believe. She quickly typed back, her thoughts racing faster than she could organize them, telling him that he did not need to come, that this was not his problem, that she had already made a mistake by involving him at all. And her message came out rushed and uneven, reflecting the conflict tearing through her, because part of her wanted to accept help more than anything. But another part, the part shaped by every disappointment and every broken promise she had endured, refused to trust something that appeared this quickly, this easily, and she pressed send with a sense of urgency that felt almost like panic, as if she needed to stop him before whatever he had decided became real. A nurse stepped into the waiting area then, her expression calm, but carrying that same quiet urgency Ava had begun to recognize, and she approached with a clipboard in hand, explaining gently that they needed a decision soon, that certain procedures required confirmation and financial authorization, and Ava felt the words settle heavily in her chest as she glanced toward the paper being held out to her, the printed lines and blank spaces that seemed to demand something she could not give, and her hand hesitated in the air as she reached for the pen, her fingers trembling again as the weight of the moment pressed down on her from all sides. The ticking clock, the soft sounds from Noah's room, the uncertainty of everything that came next. Her phone buzzed again before she could touch the paper, sharp and insistent in her hand, and she looked down almost reflexively, her breath catching as another message appeared. This one shorter, firmer, carrying a tone that left no room for argument or dismissal. Do not sign anything. I am already on my way. The words sent a strange, conflicting wave through her, something that felt dangerously close to relief mixed with a deeper confusion that she could not ignore, because this was not how strangers acted. This was not how situations like hers were supposed to unfold. And yet the certainty in his message, the absence of hesitation, made it harder to dismiss than anything else he had said so far. She looked back at the clipboard, at the nurse who was waiting patiently but clearly under pressure herself. And for a moment Ava felt completely suspended between two choices, one she understood, one she had already been forced to consider, and another that made no sense but somehow felt impossible to ignore. And her grip on the pen loosened slightly as her thoughts raced, calculating time, distance, probability, wondering how long it would take for someone to actually get here, wondering if this was real or if she was holding on to something that would disappear the moment she needed it most. The nurse spoke again, gently reminding her that they could not delay much longer, and Ava nodded faintly, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked for a few more minutes, just a few. And the nurse hesitated before agreeing, stepping back to give her space, leaving Ava alone again with the decision hanging in the air around her. She lowered the pen slowly, her heart pounding as she looked down at her phone one more time, at the last message that still glowed on the screen, and for reasons she could not fully explain, she set the pen aside instead of signing, her hand pulling back as if guided by something she did not fully understand. And as she sat there in the harsh hospital light, caught between fear and hope, one thought echoed quietly in her mind, stronger with each passing second. What if he actually comes? The minutes stretched in a way that made every second feel heavier than the last, and Ava could feel it pressing down on her chest as she sat there with her phone still in her hand, her eyes flicking between the darkened screen and the hallway beyond, as if something might change if she just watched closely enough. But nothing did. The fluorescent lights remained harsh and unforgiving. The distant sounds of hospital equipment continued in their steady, indifferent rhythm, and the door to Noah's room stayed only slightly open, just enough for her to hear the fragile reminder of why she could not afford to make the wrong decision. She forced herself to stand, her legs stiff from sitting too long, and moved toward the doorway, her hand brushing lightly against the frame as she stepped inside, her gaze immediately drawn to the small figure in the bed, Noah's face pale against the white sheets. His tiny fingers curled weakly as if holding onto something invisible, and the sight tightened. Something deep inside her, something that had already been stretched to its limit, and she swallowed hard as she leaned closer, whispering softly that she was there, that she was not going anywhere, even though the truth was she did not know how she was going to keep that promise. Behind her, the hallway carried a different kind of movement now, quicker footsteps, hushed voices, the kind that hinted at urgency without revealing its cause. And Ava turned slightly, her attention caught by the shift even before she fully understood it, her instincts sharpening in a way that made her heart start to race again. Because something was happening, something just outside her view. Her phone buzzed once more, the vibration sharp in the quiet room, and she pulled it out quickly, her breath catching as she saw a new message, not from the stranger this time, but from an unknown number attached to the hospital system, confirming that her account was being reviewed, that there had been a request placed on her behalf. And she blinked at the screen, confusion washing over her as the words settled in, because she had not spoken to anyone, had not filled out any forms, had not done anything that would trigger a review like that, and yet it was happening, already moving forward without her, as if someone else had stepped into her situation and taken control of it. She stepped back into the hallway, her eyes scanning the space as if she might find an explanation written somewhere in the movement around her. And that was when she saw it, a small cluster of hospital staff gathered near the front desk, their postures subtly different, more attentive, more alert, and among them stood a man who did not belong to the quiet routine of the place, his presence cutting through the space with a kind of calm authority that made people shift without realizing it, his posture straight, his expression focused, his gaze moving quickly as if searching for something specific. And for a moment Ava simply stared, her mind struggling to connect what she was seeing with the message still echoing in her head, because it felt too fast, too unreal, like something that should not have reached her this quickly. The man spoke briefly to one of the staff members, his voice low but carrying a certainty that did not invite hesitation, and within seconds the nurse who had spoken to Ava earlier turned toward him, nodding as if receiving instructions rather than giving them, and Ava felt her breath hitch. Again, her pulse quickening as a realization began to form, fragile but undeniable, because there was only one explanation that made sense, only one reason someone like that would be here, moving through the hospital as if he already knew exactly what needed to be done. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, and this time she did not need to look to know who it was, her fingers tightening slightly before she finally glanced down at the screen, her heart pounding as the message appeared, simple and direct, leaving no room for doubt anymore. I am here. Which room? And for a moment Ava could not move, could not speak, could not even fully breathe, because the line between fear and hope had just disappeared completely, leaving her standing in the middle of something she could no longer control. Ava's fingers hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second that felt impossibly long, her mind racing through every possibility, every risk, every outcome that could come from answering that simple question. And then something inside her shifted, something that had already been leaning in this direction since the moment she chose not to sign the paper. And she typed the room number with a trembling urgency before she could second-guess herself again, pressing send as if that single action might anchor everything that was unfolding around her into something real. Her heart pounded harder the moment the message disappeared, and she looked up instinctively, her eyes scanning the hallway as if expecting him to appear instantly. But the corridor remained the same for a brief second longer, nurses moving quickly between rooms, the distant hum of hospital activity continuing without pause. And then the rhythm changed, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but enough that Ava felt it, before she fully saw it. The way conversations quieted just slightly as someone approached, the way attention shifted without anyone meaning to give it. She stepped out of Noah's room slowly, her hand still gripping her phone, her breath shallow as she turned toward the direction of the front desk. And there he was, closer now, unmistakable in the way he carried himself, not rushing, but moving with a kind of controlled urgency that made everything else seem slower by comparison, his eyes scanning the numbers on the doors until they landed on her. And in that moment the distance between them seemed to collapse completely, replaced by a tension that neither of them had time to question. For a second neither of them spoke, and Ava became painfully aware of how she must look, exhausted, overwhelmed, completely out of place in the presence of someone who seemed to belong to an entirely different world. And yet there was no judgment in his expression, only focus, only a quiet certainty that made her chest tighten again for reasons she could not explain. He stepped closer, stopping just enough distance away to not overwhelm her, his voice low but steady as he asked, "Ava?" And hearing her name from him sent a brief shock through her, a reminder of how much he already knew despite being a stranger, and she nodded slowly, her voice catching slightly as she confirmed it, unable to form anything more than that single acknowledgement. He did not waste another second, turning his attention immediately toward the room behind her, his gaze shifting with a sharp intensity that made it clear his priorities had already aligned with hers without needing further explanation. And he moved past her toward the doorway, pausing only briefly as if giving her the chance to follow, which she did without thinking, her steps automatic as she stayed close behind him. Inside the room, the soft beeping of the monitor filled the space again, and Daniel's eyes moved quickly over the scene, taking in every detail in a way that felt both efficient and deeply focused, his attention settling on Noah with a stillness that lasted just a fraction longer than expected, something in his expression tightening almost imperceptibly before he stepped back, turning toward the nurse who had followed them in, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that shifted the entire dynamic of the room as he asked for the billing status, the current treatment plan, the immediate requirements, and the nurse responded without hesitation, her earlier urgency now redirected toward him as if he had become the point of authority in the situation. Ava stood near the edge of the room, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched everything unfold, her mind struggling to keep up with how quickly control had shifted, how the pressure that had been crushing her moments ago was now being absorbed by someone else, someone who had walked in and changed everything without asking for permission. And yet she could not fully relax, could not fully trust what she was seeing, because it still felt too fragile, too unreal. Daniel reached into his jacket then, pulling out his phone and making a brief call, his voice low and precise as he instructed someone on the other end to process the full amount immediately, to ensure there were no delays, no interruptions, and Ava felt her breath catch again as the words settled in, the reality of what he was doing hitting her all at once, and she took a small step forward, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "You do not have to do this." But he looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time, and there was something in his expression that stopped her completely. Something that was not just about helping, not just about the situation in front of them, but something deeper, something she could not yet understand. And after a brief pause he replied quietly, "I know," before his gaze shifted back to Noah, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if a question had just formed in his mind that he was not ready to ask out loud. The room seemed to shift subtly after that, as if the air itself had adjusted to a new balance, one where the weight Ava had been carrying alone was no longer entirely hers, and she felt it in the way the nurse straightened slightly, in the way the tension in the space softened just enough to let her breathe a little deeper, though not fully, not yet, because everything still felt fragile, like something that could unravel if she let herself believe in it too quickly. Daniel remained near Noah's bed, his posture composed but attentive, his eyes not leaving the small figure for more than a second at a time. And there was something about the way he observed, not distant, not detached, but focused in a way that suggested he was processing more than what was immediately visible, as if he was searching for something beneath the surface, something that had not yet been said. The nurse returned with an update, her tone noticeably different now, more assured, explaining that the billing department had confirmed full coverage for the immediate treatment plan, that there would be no delays, no interruptions, and Ava felt the words settle into her chest slowly, almost cautiously, because they were everything she had been hoping for, and yet they felt too sudden to fully trust, and she let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the pressure eased for the first time in hours. Daniel nodded once at the nurse, acknowledging the information without needing further explanation, and then his attention returned to Noah, his gaze lingering there again, longer this time, and Ava noticed the shift, subtle but undeniable, the way his expression tightened just enough to suggest recognition, or maybe calculation, and her heart skipped a beat at the thought, because she could feel it too now, that something unspoken was forming in the space between them, something that had nothing to do with the hospital or the bill or the immediate crisis. She stepped closer almost without thinking, drawn by the same quiet tension, her voice soft but steady as she said, "His name is Noah," and Daniel's eyes flicked toward her for a brief moment before returning to the child, as if confirming something internally, as if the name fit into a pattern only he could see, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough to feel significant. Ava's fingers curled slightly at her sides, her instincts beginning to shift from fear to something more uncertain, more questioning, because the way he was looking at her son was not the way a stranger would look. It was too focused, too intent, and she felt a flicker of unease rise alongside the fragile relief that had just begun to settle. Daniel straightened slowly, turning toward her with a measured movement that carried the same calm authority he had shown since arriving. But now there was something else beneath it, something sharper, more personal, and it made Ava's breath catch again as she held his gaze, waiting without realizing she was doing so. For a moment it seemed like he might speak, like he might ask something that had been building in his mind since the moment he saw the hospital bill. But instead he glanced once more toward Noah, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, as if holding back a thought that was not yet ready to be voiced. Ava could feel the question forming anyway, hanging in the air between them even without words, and it made her chest tighten again, not with the same panic as before, but with a different kind of tension, one that hinted at something deeper, something that could change everything in a way she had not prepared for. She took a small breath, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked, "Why are you helping me?" And for the first time since he arrived, Daniel did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting between her and the child in a way that suggested the answer was not simple, not something he could explain in a single sentence. And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, because it carried the weight of a truth that had not yet been revealed. Daniel did not answer her question right away, and the silence that followed felt deliberate, as if he was weighing something carefully, something that mattered more than the immediate situation, and Ava felt it in the way his gaze lingered on Noah again before returning to her, not avoiding the question but not rushing to respond either. And that hesitation made her pulse quicken with a new kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with money or hospital bills, but everything to do with whatever connection he was silently tracing in his mind. He took a slow breath, his posture still composed, but his eyes sharper now, more focused, as if he had moved past the surface level of the situation and into something deeper, something personal. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, measured in a way that suggested he was choosing each word carefully. Because something about this does not feel like a coincidence. And the answer, simple as it was, sent a ripple through Ava that she could not immediately explain, because it was not reassurance, not comfort, but something else entirely, something that made her chest tighten again with uncertainty. She frowned slightly, her brows drawing together as she tried to understand what he meant. But before she could ask anything further, Daniel stepped closer to Noah's bed again, his attention narrowing as if he was confirming something only he could see. And Ava watched him, her unease growing with every second. That passed, because the way he was looking at her son was no longer just concern or curiosity. It was something more precise, more analytical, like he was fitting pieces together in real time. The monitor beeped steadily beside them, the sound grounding her just enough to keep her from spiraling into the questions forming in her mind. And she moved closer as well, almost instinctively placing herself between Daniel and the bed, not in a defensive way, but in a protective reflex she could not suppress. And he noticed it, his gaze flicking briefly to her before softening just slightly, acknowledging the instinct without challenging it. "When was he born?" he asked. Then, his tone still calm, but carrying a weight that made the question feel heavier than it should have been, and Ava hesitated, her breath catching for a moment, because something about the way he asked made it feel like more than simple curiosity, like the answer mattered in a way she did not yet understand. And she replied quietly, giving the date without thinking too far ahead, because it was a fact she had repeated countless times to doctors and nurses, something routine and ordinary. And yet the moment the words left her mouth, she saw the change in him, subtle but undeniable. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze dropping briefly as if he was running calculations in his mind, aligning timelines, connecting something that had been just out of reach until now. And when he looked back up, there was no hesitation left in his expression, only a quiet certainty that made Ava's stomach twist with a sudden, unfamiliar fear. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to dismiss the feeling before it could fully take hold, her voice unsteady as she said, "Why are you asking me that?" But Daniel did not answer directly. Not yet. Instead, he took one more step closer, his attention shifting fully to Noah, as if the final piece of something had just fallen into place. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, carrying a tension that had not been there before. "Ava, I need you to think carefully." And the way he said her name made her heart pound harder, because it sounded different now, more personal, more certain, and she felt the room close and slightly around her as she waited for what he would say next, every instinct telling her that whatever was coming would change everything she thought she understood about this night, about this stranger, about her life. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on Noah as he asked the question that finally broke through the fragile balance between them, his voice steady but carrying a depth that left no room for misunderstanding. "How old is he exactly?" Ava felt the question settle into the room, like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. And for a moment she did not answer, not because she did not know, but because the way he asked it made the answer feel heavier than it had ever been before, as if it carried meaning beyond a simple number. And her fingers tightened slightly at her sides as she looked at Noah, then back at Daniel, trying to understand what he was seeing that she was not. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. When she finally spoke, steady but cautious, "He is 6 months old." And the words seemed to echo in the space between them, hanging there long enough for her to notice the exact moment Daniel reacted, subtle but unmistakable, his gaze sharpening, his jaw tightening just slightly, as if that confirmation had aligned perfectly with something already forming in his mind. Ava's heart began to beat faster again, not with the same panic from before, but with a growing sense of unease that she could not ignore, because she could see it now, the shift in him, the way his attention was no longer just focused on helping but on understanding, on connecting something that reached beyond this room, beyond this night. And she took a small step back without realizing it, her instincts pulling her toward distance even as her mind demanded answers. "Why does that matter?" she asked, her voice more guarded now, the earlier vulnerability replaced by a quiet tension that wrapped around her words. And Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, his expression no longer neutral but not harsh either, just focused in a way that made it clear he was choosing his next words carefully, measuring what to reveal and what to hold back. He glanced once more at Noah, his eyes lingering there, as if searching for something that could confirm what he was already beginning to believe. And then he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that made Ava's chest tighten instantly. "Because 6 months ago, I was not where I was supposed to be." And the statement was vague, almost incomplete, but it was enough to send a sharp ripple through Ava's thoughts, enough to make her breath catch as her mind tried to connect the implication he was not fully stating. She shook her head slightly, a reflex more than a decision, as if rejecting the direction the conversation was taking before it could fully form, because it did not make sense. It could not make sense, and yet the certainty in his tone made it impossible to dismiss entirely. and she felt her pulse quicken as she tried to steady herself, her voice barely above a whisper now. "What are you saying?" Daniel did not answer immediately, and that silence spoke louder than anything else, stretching between them with a tension that felt almost tangible. And when he finally met her eyes again, there was no hesitation left, no uncertainty, only a quiet intensity that made everything else in the room fade into the background. "I am saying," he began slowly, each word deliberate, "that I need to know exactly when he was born, and where you were 9 months before that." And the question landed with a force that made Ava feel as if the ground beneath her had shifted, her mind racing, her heart pounding. Because in that moment it was no longer just about a stranger who had helped her, no longer just about a hospital bill or a moment of unexpected kindness. It was something else entirely, something that reached into her past and pulled it forward into the present. And as she stood there, caught between disbelief and a growing, undeniable fear, one thought rose above all the others, clearer and more terrifying with each passing second. This was not a coincidence at all.